Welcome back. Well, we've went through an overview of dry fly hackle and how we grade it and colors and stuff like that. Now I want to go over kind of a general overview of why you would buy any of it, what you're going to use it for. I think anybody watching this knows that this is dry fly hackle. And regardless, and I've got a fly in here, so regardless if you're going to wrap your hackle this way, or if you're going to palmer it forward like this, or if you're going to do it as a parachute, it doesn't matter. What you know, if you're going to do any one of those styles, it really doesn't. Of course, we're just whipping through to show you. No matter which one of those you're going to do, it really doesn't matter. The bottom line is on any one of these flies, from the most traditional here, this fly, this hackle, and by the way, the hackle does not float. The hackle it's not magic. It sits on these tips, does not break through the film, and if it does, it's still riding on these edges, and I don't know if you can see that. Then you go to what the fly, this is a really old school style fly, right? This is a parachute, which is taken over the world. It's just pretty much all here. That fly goes down, the hook breaks through the meniscus, the surface film, and it sits on this hackle right here in the film, on top of the water. Same thing with this, sits on these, the tail, all these little things. When it gets down, it just suspends it. It doesn't let it break through the surface. And so at this day and age, virtually all the hackle is great. I mean, it's like there's no real, in the whiting and the higher dollar necks, they're all pretty much the same. They're as far as their job. Their hackle goes around, almost everything's a parachute now. Like I said, like this one right here. And it sits, when that goes through, it just sits on the tips sit there and doesn't let it go through. It's just surface tension is all it is. And so, and we all know that. That's not in question what we're doing here. But I want to show you kind of what goes through my mind when I select a hackle, because, and I can tell you, I was, for a long time in my life, I was somewhat confused, because in the old days there was a lot bigger differential between this one and this one and that one. I mean, there was a difference. At this point, the grading is so incredible and the necks have become so good that I don't really pay attention to grading at all. I just think they're so good anymore that it doesn't really matter. I was just showing Jeremy, this should be a saddle, for God's sakes. That neck right there is coming out of the sweet spot. It's so long, we went over what grade is, you know, the barbular count and the consistency of the feather. So things kind of changed for me now. I don't walk in and go look for the silver grade or the golds or whatever it is. I just go in and I do a perusal of what I want to tie with the fly, and it's almost always shades of colors. And so if I was looking for a high concentration of really small hackle, 24 down to say 18, and I wanted to tie a lot of flies, I for sure would go and look at Red Label. And so Red Label is just you know, the whiting Red Label, and hence the label here. But there's such a, like, this thing is just so ridiculously high in count in small hackle, and that it would be, especially if you're tying a lot of flies, you're just going to get a huge bang for your buck out of this. But in the color world is what, you know, when Jeremy and I were sitting down to film this, we got talking about it, and so much of it for me is shades and uniqueness and things like that. But if I know, like this, if you ask me in the whiting world, that started with the grizzly, because that's in the original form of the Hoffmans, and the browns, because there was so much. The most popular fly in the world is an Adams for hackle flies. And so you blend these two, right? And so there tended to be, the Red Label tends to be a very specific in color. They've bred it in to get these colors really the same a lot. And so you go through grizzlies and your browns, and this is, you know, you go into your gingers, is still an offshoot of the browns. And then you know, to a lesser extent, the badgers and your darker colors. But for me, it kind of tends, in the smaller hackle, I tend to look for the basic colors, the real colors, you know, brown and grizzly and ginger. And that, for a little exception to that, you look for the variants like this one here, which is just, doesn't really have a color. And they don't have a lot of that because they've done such a good job in standardizing these basic 8, 10 colors, which I think of as my Red Label, super small hackle, long hackle. Those feathers right there are longer than a lot of saddles of the old days. I mean, they're just ridiculous. I'd probably get 8 flies out of one of those things if you tried hard. But for me, I go in and the first thing I'm looking for, I establish what I'm tying. I tie very few flies with 18 or smaller with hackle on them. I do, you know, I just don't do many of them. But I tie a ton of size 14, 16, 14, 12, 10s, you know, the drakes and stuff like that. And so I really like to look for shades. And so when my standard stuff, and again, I don't look at the grade. I walk in on that neck. I got 300 necks sitting right there in Red Label. I look for what appeals to my eye, knowing that from pro grade to silver, unless you're Charlie Craven or Davey McFeel, these guys could make a feather out of their pillow work. They're so good. Unless you're that superstar, very few people, including myself, could ever see the difference between a pro grade, as far as just general tying, not just doing a million flies, one thing, just gonna have a neck around to tie a few flies. I would never know the difference. But I do know the difference when I look at my flies for shade. And so in the old days, like I said, when I would generally, you know, I was working off of these 2 colors, and I really like dyed colors too. And I would work with a lot of light olive dyes, trying to get that matched to my mayflies. But then, when I'm truly looking for myself and not thinking about production tying of any sort, just for me, I always gravitated to the Heberts, because the Heberts tended to work in the dun colors, and these are all duns right here. I just grabbed some off the wall. But from these incredibly super rich, like this is actually a dun. It looks jet black, I'm sure, on the camera. But I mean, this thing is just a super bronzy dun. And so I would look at these colors for shades, because they always have these super rich earth tony shades to them, right? And nowadays, and even back in the old days, they had a good count. But nowadays, they're very close in the regards to having that super small stuff. Not quite the number that you would find in a whiting, or in a Red Label. And I tended to get a few more of the bigger fly sizes, which I tie more of, right? I really like to 16s to 12s, so I do a lot of them. Below that, I do, you know, just don't tie as many. But the shades of these are just incredible, and you're also getting the high feather count, you're getting the length of the feather, the incredible barbular count, and you're getting those super, you know, thin rakuses, so they all spin incredibly. And so when I was looking at my earth tone stuff, especially my mayfly stuff, I would always gravitate towards color, towards these, and I frequently would end up in the Hebert, because those are my earth tones that I like to tie with my mayflies. And then, because as I already did this, and you know, we talked about the grades, or the grades and the skews. So there's four lines here. And so the problem with the Hebert and the whiting for me, because I tie so many of the bigger hackled flies when I use hackle, that I was running out. And this feather right here, I would have a hard time getting a size 10 fly on this silver. The necks were getting very thin, and you know, the hackle count was super, and so many feathers in here. But when I got down to the base in the old days, I could take one of these and I could tie a size 4, even a 2 sometimes, hex, which is the biggest mayfly in the world, right? I could tie out of these. Now I'm going to really push it on that feather to get it to a 12. 10s I'm not going to get. So go to Whiting, and I explained to him our dilemma, and we go into, and he says, well, you're looking for the Heritage, and because it's got a higher, it still has the high count, and it has the rich colors, but you start getting bigger hackle. So when you get into this Heritage, and again, and I just grabbed a few. Do you remember what the total count at 40 color shades?
At least it's like Tin and Grizzly. And
yeah, and this one, because it wasn't bred so much for this consistency of the, you know, dun flavor or grizzly flavor or brown, the Heritage hackle did 2 things for me. 1, it gives me the super quality hackle. 2, it gives me this plethora of shades. And shades is what I'm looking for. And the last but not least is it has a high content of bigger hackle. When you go into this, and this is really good for beginning anglers, or tires, I mean, because before that, when we would tell people, you can go pro grade, but it's still, $60 or whatever, and people would buy and I started on these, and so did everybody else on earth. Well, in the old days, go back 20 years, were called Indian necks. Well, you can look at this and you can see the hackle is, I mean, I don't know if you can see that or not, but it's an 1.5 to 2 inches long, right? So, I mean, you can see it's here. Or you go into one of these, it's 4, 5, 6, or you go into the red labels and they're this long, right? This makes it very hard. And their stems are not really, the rachis is not really supple. You got a really small barbular count. So you ended up wrapping and wrapping and wrapping to get that footprint that you're looking for. And it, by the way, if you don't understand that when I talk about barbulars, give me one that's dark here. When you look at barbulars, and I'll try to get this up where you're looking at it. We showed it when we graded, but when you look at this feather, it's the edge of it is your barbular, right? That's what actually suspends your fly. So, and I happen to be, I'm not a big fan of a lot of hackle. I like to, you're supposed to be emulating 6 legs, and so when you end up having to wrap a lot of turns to get something that looks like it would suspend your fly, it gets a little funky looking. Where with these, you can wrap 2 or 3 times around that, and man, you get a beautiful footprint. And there's a, that's everybody's, that's your choice. I always oversize. I was watching Charlie Craven the other night and addicted to him. His guy is a freak show. And he likes, and I'm sure, that you could ask 100 tires. I like to oversize my hackle, and he made a point of saying, I know a lot of people like to oversize their hackle. I do not. Well, it's hard to argue with the beauty of his flies. So that's your choice. But in this, when we got to the Heritage, what I was looking for is the bigger hackle, and this one is very low on 18. You just don't find, when you find 18s, they're in there. But it starts, I tell people this hackle starts at 18 and it's really heavy in 16, 14, 12. So that's where I'm at. And again, my number one thing when I go and look at these things is always shade. I'm looking for something that I probably have 100 grizzlies. I'm looking for a shade. Like for example, this would be a good example of shade. And we talked about this shade, meaning this is dun Cree. This is kind of it's not really grizzly anymore. It's kind of got a brown hue to it. And that's what, and Cree, when you start looking at the Crees and stuff like that, these are the freak shows. This isn't so much shade as it is a color but it's just unique. And so when I go out and I look at when I go to the wall and looking over there at this thing, I look at the shades. And the beautiful thing about the Heritage, and one for how I tie and what I look for, is that you start with grizzly, and we have, because it hasn't been standardized so much, we have 8 to 10 shades of grizzly. And then you go into it's very heavy in these duns, and this is an actual dun here, really pale dun, but there's about 6 shades of dun. And that takes you from dark dun, medium, light, pale, and all that. Then you go into your yellow phases of dun, which are like Cahill and honey duns. And that takes you into your badgers like this, anywhere from badger, light badger to champagne badger here, the really bubbly edged, like badger color, that's more yellowy, into your silvers. And it just never ends because it's just a wide spectrum. It has not been developed solely to be in these like just duns. And so for me personally, because of the way I tie, some would say poorly, the way I tie, I look for these shades and I look for that little bit bigger hackle. And last but not least is what was called the high and dry. And I talked about this when we were talking about grading. And this is almost all grizzly. I mean, the ones mostly you'll see it. And there's a high concentration of dyed colors in this too. But again, for the average tire, I swear to you, I didn't have a neck this good 15 years ago in my life, and they just didn't exist. And so I like shades. I particularly like dyed colors. And a lot of people on my working flies. I mean, when I go in and I want to, if I see a freak show done, I have to have it like everybody else. But on my working flies, I tend to be in the dark bar gingers and the regular duns. And so I don't really, I look just for the feather that I look on the wall, look for it. If it looks good to me, I'm so confident that in Whiting's grading process that it's going to be, there's going to be more feathers than I'll ever use in the neck. And I find the color I want first, knowing full well that the quality is already there. I don't have to worry about it. And so for me personally, like I said, standard color grizzly browns, I lean a little bit towards the red labels. Doesn't matter if it's pro grade. There was a pro grade up here somewhere. This one right here, this thing is freak show, right? If it's pro grade to silver, and when I go into my shades of dun in particular, that earth tone stuff, I really tend to lean towards the Heberts. And then when I go into my bigger stuff, especially, you know, most of my big mayflies, I tend to lean towards the Heritage because of the larger sizes and the incredible number of shades. And so that's when when I get into this, like I said, I forget what we ended up with when we brought this series in, but I think it's close to 4 dozen. 48 colors of birds, and that goes from black and white all through the grizzlies, all through the duns, all through the champagne stuff, and the badgers, and all the browns. And so it's really important. And if you have a specific color, call, because we photograph all this stuff. But if you've got one and you're looking for it, let us know. We'll find it. But anyway, that's kind of what in your dry fly world, what I'm looking for today. You know, how I go about looking for my hackle. All right. Hope you like it. Hope it helps you out.